Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to our panel on the fight to legalize rooming houses, winning rights for Toronto's most vulnerable tenants. My name is Jeremy Withers, and I'll be hosting the event tonight. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto, and I'm also the outreach coordinator for the U of T School of Cities Affordable Housing Challenge Project. So our mission at AHCP is to bring together housing scholars with advocates and decision makers to discuss and to advance solutions to Toronto's affordable housing crisis. And we're all relieved to be able to resume our monthly panel series after almost half a year of putting these events on strike in solidarity with the censure that was placed on U of T. So there was a censure raised against U of T about 6 months ago due to compelling allegations of hiring practices that privilege the views of wealthy donors over academic faculty. And at the heart of this crisis, which thankfully has been resolved for the moment, lay the question of whether wealthy donors could dissuade the law department of hiring a practitioner of international law who has prolifically and who has written prolifically and powerfully on the subject of Palestinian human rights. And we at AHCP feel strongly that raising one's voice on such a long-standing yet urgent issue is admirable. And we don't want to work in a university that would lead anyone to think of such actions as potentially compromising their ability to contribute here. So tonight, we are honored to have 3 experts with us on this panel. But before I introduce them, we need to make an acknowledgement. The subject we're here to address tonight, the inadequate housing and displacement from the city faced by rooming house tenants, it's a very current and pressing issue. But if we look at it from a longer term perspective, we can also see it as a consequence of a long-standing process of plunder and displacement, a process on which we can see Canada was in fact founded. So this land about which we're speaking today was stolen from the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit, communities that for countless generations have passed on the lesson that this land ought to be stewarded by all who take part in using it. It was stolen by white supremacists who divided and subdivided it and sold and resold it to the highest bidder. Today in Ontario, the right to determine land use is still largely denied to the wider communities living on it and granted instead to the highest bidder. And too often what this means is that the right to determine who gets to live where and who gets evicted is granted to the country's wealthiest, often white settlers. So this is true on many of the subjects we've addressed through these panel series, whether it's looking at our province's weak rent controls or our city's zoning practices for new developments, which currently have practically no affordability requirements, or as we're talking about today, our under-regulation of rooming houses. So I hope this recognition will guide us in thinking through what it means to decolonize Toronto. I see that struggle as intrinsically bound up with a struggle to wrestle control of yet land use from those settlers who view it simply as a means to inflate their private wealth and to place it in the hands of communities making a home here. So tonight we're going to hear from 3 experts on a truly timely subject. Toronto City Council is set to vote potentially as soon as Friday on a new regulatory framework that would legalize rooming houses across the city. And we're going to hear about how this has been a decades-long struggle to get the city to do so, but also to do so in tandem with an array of regulations and funding, which would ensure that this rare source of deeply affordable housing is protected. And many of the advocates who are with us today, both as panelists, but also people tuning in, have been part of that struggle. And I look forward to engaging them in conversation about the question of whether city staff proposal is up to the challenge of really protecting these tenants' rights. So I just want to conclude by stressing in a big picture how important it is to find ways to protect this housing stock. We all know that average rents across the city have surged over the past 2 decades. So since 2000, they've risen nearly twice as fast as the average income of a renter household. And in this sense, we know that most renters are bearing the brunt of Toronto's housing crisis. But it's really the lower income renters in our city that are truly bearing the brunt, with many living right now in a state of crisis. Right now, there are hundreds of thousands of renters in this city that rightly fear they are one eviction away from displacement or homelessness. The overall vacancy rate may have gone up, but for deeply affordable housing, it remains practically zero. So the median asking rent for a vacant bachelor apartment in Toronto right now is $1,300, $1,400, $1,500 a month, depending on the area of the city. So if you rely on a monthly housing benefit of just under $400 from OW, or just under $500 from ODSP, if you're evicted from your home right now, you're in a truly dangerous situation. So in this context, rooming houses, which the city estimates tend to rent for between $400 to $700 a month, they should be seen as life rafts. These are the last line of defense against falling into homelessness. And for many others, they're a springboard. They're the only affordable option for those escaping homelessness. And yet for years, we've been losing these units at a rapid pace because our city's regulatory framework offers limited protections against their gentrification. So for tonight's event, we're going to begin with a presentation by Philippa Campsie, addressing the fragmented history of rooming house regulations in Toronto. And after this, we'll open up the floor for 10 minutes of questions, for her, because unfortunately, she's going to have to step off the call afterwards due to prior commitments. So we really appreciate her being here. After this, I'm going to introduce our last two presenters, Joy Connolly and Regini David, who, among other topics, are going to bring us up to date on the campaign for the city to implement a strong framework. And then we're going to spend the remainder of our time until 8 p.m. With Joy and Regini fielding some questions and perhaps some more open discussion about how people can get involved in this campaign. So to start off, we have Philippa Campsie, who is an adjunct professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto, where she earned a planning degree. She's also a freelance writer and a researcher who has written several studies of rooming houses, most recently for the Neighborhood Change Research Partnership. So Philippa, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Toronto's had rooming houses in all parts of the city for many decades. We can call them by different names, but they're a constant in city life. And no matter what we call them, or how we try to regulate them, or even whether we acknowledge their existence, they're always going to be there. And the reason for that is simple. When you don't have much money, it's always going to be cheaper to rent a single room than to rent a fully self-contained apartment. And Jeremy's already told you about the prices of those things. Now, 100 years ago, people had the option of renting a room in a family house, and a lot of families made ends meet by taking in boarders or lodgers. That model fell out of favor after the Second World War. More people were trying to have homes of their own. But at the same time, in that post-war period, a lot of older, larger family houses were converted to rooming houses. And in these houses, a number of unrelated people would each have a room, and they would share a bathroom, a kitchen, or both. They didn't attract much attention until the late 1960s. A man called Norman Brown, who was a rooming house tenant and had lived for years in rooming houses, felt that people were unaware of what it was like to live in a rooming house. He interviewed other tenants and he wrote a report. He called it Roomers, the Lost Race of Society. He felt they were invisible and forgotten and unheard. Around the same time, there were also a series of fatal rooming house fires in the late 1960s and early 1970s that caused alarm at the city. And so the city responded in 1974 by introducing licensing. I am, of course, talking about the old city of Toronto, the downtown area before amalgamation, the core of the city. Rooming houses were allowed in the zoning there, and licensing added an extra layer whereby the buildings could be inspected and checked they had adequate fire protection, for example. Interestingly, even before this happened, a number of studies had predicted that what would happen after licensing would be a loss of rooming house stock. And that was in fact true. 4 years later, just 4 years later, in 1978, the Toronto Star reported that about half of the stock had been lost. There had been, in 1974, when licensing came in, there'd been about 1,200 rooming houses, and about half of them had disappeared in the first 4 years after licensing was introduced. Every other city that has introduced licensing has found pretty much the same thing, and there's a reason for it. When licensing is introduced, the owners and operators take one of three decisions. Ideally, they will bring their house up to the standards required, obtain a license, and continue in business. But some people will decide that it's just too expensive or too much hassle, or they're getting close to retirement and they don't want to do that kind of thing, and they just decide to let the business go. They may sell it to somebody else, but they just may sell out and go out of business. And of course, there are always a few who continue in business, but they don't get the license. They operate under the radar. And that, of course, maintains the problem that Norman Brown was talking about, about the houses being invisible and the tenants being invisible. So they were legally invisible. However, it is worth stating that allowing rooming houses through zoning bylaws and licensing does not lead to an increase in the number of rooming houses. And anyone who fears that zoning and licensing will vastly increase the number of rooming houses and their tenants is quite mistaken. Today, if you go to the city's website, you'll find that as of January the 1st, 2021, there were 211 licensed rooming houses in the former city of Toronto. The city publishes the list online, and they're all identified by address. There are also about 34 bachelorettes, which are very small self-contained units in Parkdale, and they're a bit of a sort of one-off. There are a few rooming houses in the former city of Etobicoke where they're called lodging houses. In the other cities, in the other parts of the city, York allows zoning houses by, allows rooming houses in its zoning, but it doesn't license them. So it's hard to know what is in York. North York and East York and Scarborough do not permit rooming houses in their zoning bylaws. So you might think there are only maybe 250 or so rooming houses in the city, but of course that's not the case. There are lots of people out there in those places where rooming houses are not permitted by zoning, but they're operating under the radar. And because they operate in all parts of the amalgamated city, they're rather different from the ones that started after the Second World War in the older houses. In the 1960s and 1970s, old Victorian family houses were not considered particularly valuable, and you could buy them up quite cheaply, convert them and turn them into rooming houses. Now, of course, they're considered very valuable indeed. And so there's competition for these places. Some of them have been bought up, deconverted from the rooming house and turned into single family dwellings again, or they might be turned into small offices. Some of them have become short-term rentals, such as Airbnb. Some of the old residential hotels have been turned back into boutique hotels or event venues. So there's further loss of the stock because of these other pressures and the real estate competition that has occurred. Meanwhile, out in the suburbs, things like split levels and bungalows and ranch style houses, and a lot of the housing stock that has been built in the last 70 or so years has been converted to rooming houses. And they serve a rather different population. It used to be thought that in general, the downtown houses served people who were living alone, mostly, but not all men, and mostly, but not all, unemployed. Today, they serve all kinds of people, including students, immigrants, working people, and even families with children. And what they all have in common, of course, is that they want to save money by renting just a room instead of renting a self-contained apartment. So fast forward to amalgamation in 1998. So that's 23 years ago. And the city of Toronto has been trying and not really succeeding to getting a handle on this issue and the different ways in which rooming houses are treated in the different parts of the city. So they started in 2003 by commissioning a report from some consultants. And the consultants were very thorough. They interviewed all kinds of people, tenants and the owner operators, as well as all kinds of city staff working in planning, in licensing, in fire protection, public health, building inspections. They also looked at what other cities were doing. The cities they studied fell into two main groups. There were those that licensed rooming houses and enforced standards proactively. At the time, that included Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Ottawa. They tended to have better rooming house stock as a result, but the problem was always finding the resources because it's time-consuming work and it takes a lot of people, a lot of staff. To some extent, that's what the City of Toronto now does. It has inspections. In order to maintain your license, you have to submit to periodic inspections and ensure that your property meets the standards. The other studies, the other cities that the consultants looked at, some of them had very strict licensing requirements, some of them had very restrictive zoning, but they didn't enforce anything unless a complaint was made. The authors of the report call this turning a blind eye to the issue. And that's more or less the approach that we have in North York and Scarborough and East York. Unless somebody complains, the city doesn't go in and look. And it doesn't know where the rooming houses are because they're not licensed. So that report had maybe 36 recommendations in it, and the city turned it over to staff to review and consider, but it never came to a vote. It never led to any kind of proposal at City Council. A further report came out in 2008, which attempted to find out a bit more about the people who were living in the rooming houses in places where they were not legal, according to the zoning bylaws. And that gave them a bit more insight, but it didn't lead to anything either. Now, in 2009, the city proposed a new harmonized bylaw for zoning across the city. And of course, it dealt with everything. It dealt with all the zoning issues and tried to make sure that zoning was consistent across the city. But it also included rooming houses. It was extremely complicated. There were 11 different categories. And in having all those different categories, in a way, the city was trying to acknowledge the status quo. So it had one category for Etobicoke, lodging houses, and another category for downtown Toronto, and another category for the other places. The zoning bylaw as a whole, with all of its provisions, faced about 700 different appeals. Things got so bogged down in the planning department that eventually the whole thing was withdrawn in 2011 and sent back for review. Over the next couple of years, the city was able to pretty much sort out everything except rooming houses. So in 2013, the harmonized zoning bylaw was passed for the city, and it went through with everything except for rooming houses, which is why we're still in the same situation as before. And of course, where rooming houses are concerned, we're in a very odd position legally. So the former cities of North York and Etobicoke and Scarborough and York and East York, they don't exist as proper legal jurisdictions. They cannot pass their own bylaws or enforce them. And one legal scholar has called them ghost jurisdictions, with ghost bylaws. And those ghost bylaws are still on the books. Some of them are very old indeed, but we can't get rid of them and we can't move on because we cannot somehow find a way to harmonize all the provisions. At the same time, in 2013, the Ontario Human Rights Commission produced a report. It was called Room for Everyone. And they made an important point there, which has to do with zoning particularly. They argued that if a bylaw has a proper planning or safety-related purpose, then there is no human rights justification for applying it in one part of the city and not in the other. It should be applied uniformly across the city, and that's the human rights perspective. And I think that's an important point, which we shouldn't lose sight of. Well, the city kept trying. It commissioned a consultation in 2015. It engaged hundreds of people in all kinds of ways. One interesting finding was that there were lots of people who were consulted who didn't actually know what the current rules were, but they wanted them changed anyway. It also, of course, located a fairly small minority, but very vocal one, that thought that rooming houses didn't belong in any kind of modern city and should simply be wiped out. So there was a bit of a stalemate, and there was nothing that was brought forward for a vote. They also commissioned yet another study of rooming house regulation in other cities to bring that up to date, and more or less the same things were found. So after all that work, what was the recommendation? More consultation. But this was going to be in conjunction with 5 pilot projects. And the pilot projects were carefully selected that they were going to be in the parts of the city outside the city core where there were post-secondary campuses. So York University, the University of Toronto at Scarborough, Humber, Seneca, Centennial, all those campuses, lots of students, and there were a lot of rooming houses that had come into being to serve the student populations of those campuses. Now, the pilot project never really got off the ground, but there was a further round of consultations in 2017, and a third took place just this year, earlier in the summer. There's another really extensive effort, tried to get everybody in there. They talked to owners and operators of multi-tenant houses, tenants, tenant service providers, housing organizations and providers, housing advocacy groups, post-secondary institutions and academics, sororities, fraternities, students and residents associations. And there were also a category called general public. So even if you weren't part of what they called the stakeholders, you could still have your say. So nobody can ever say that the citizens of Toronto have not had a chance to weigh in on this subject. And nor can they say that the city has acted in haste, since they've been studying the subject for pretty much 2 decades. So what have we learned from this very brief summary of the last few years? Well, as I said before, we can certainly conclude that licensing rooming houses does not lead to an increase in the number of rooming houses. There are some Toronto residents who fear that by licensing rooming houses, they're going to open the floodgates and there will be more and more houses converted. I think we can say with a certain amount of confidence that that's not going to happen. We can also see that the invisibility and inaudibility of rooming house tenants remains a problem. One of the reasons I quoted that whole list of all the people who were consulted, tenants was one group, and there were all these other groups, and the tenants were not necessarily the most influential of the groups or the most vocal of the groups. So they are just one amongst a whole number of other stakeholders who feel that they should have a say in rooming houses. But it's really the tenants whose lives are at stake. I mean, it's their lives, the roof over their heads that's important. And finally, there's a pattern whereby the City of Toronto keeps deciding not to decide. It is studied and consulted and studied and consulted and deferred and pushed recommendations out. So finally, we may see a decision made. I hope they decide to actually do something at this point, but it remains to be seen. And our other speakers will look at that in a bit more detail. Thanks very much. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Philippa, for that extensive and rather discouraging history. Although here on the precipice of a potential vote, it's it's good to reflect on where we've been. I want to I'm gonna ask you a question that came up for me with your presentation, but I also wanted to encourage everyone, if you have a comment you want to share or a question you want to ask. I know looking at a gallery view, I see we've got quite a lot of expertise here as well, so it would be great to engage you in the conversation. But I just wanted to start off by asking you, your presentation kind of tells a story of, as you say, a subject that has been consulted on and studied and pilot projected for literally 2 decades, and yet behind this tale of a bureaucracy, moving forward is a lot of blood, sweat, and tears of hardworking housing advocates trying to put feet to the fire the city to not allow this to be another, well, we'll push it forward to a consultation in 1 year, and I just wonder, having studied this so closely, what are the basic roadblocks you've seen, these advocates come up against when trying to get buy-in from the city to move forward?
Well, the people who are going to make the decisions are the councillors. And the councillors in certain parts of the city very much fear that if they appear to permit rooming houses, they will never get reelected. I've looked at some of the submissions that have been made for the current proposal, and there are still a lot of people who are violently opposed to the whole idea of rooming houses. Now, of course, the rooming houses are there and always have been, but they don't like the idea. They want them stamped out. They feel that they're a source of all kinds of problems. From parking to property standards and so forth. So the councillors who represent people with those opinions are very, very reluctant to go against what they see as the expressed wish of their constituents. So that's probably the biggest barrier, and the city has never felt that enough councillors are on board. And I think that's one of the reasons it just keeps deferring and deferring and deferring, hoping that maybe some new people will be elected that don't feel that way, hoping that perhaps with all these consultations, people might start to change their attitudes. And I think some of that has happened. Looking at some of those submissions, there are more positive ones than I think there would have been maybe 5 years ago. So the consultations have not been without an effect. People have had a chance to learn more about these issues, and in some cases, I think it has softened attitudes to some extent. But attitudes have been pretty hard in the past, and the councillors don't want to vote against what they feel their constituents want.
Wow. Okay. So really, it just comes down to the city not wanting necessarily to put forward something that is going to be batted down again and again. So we have a question concerning the definition of a rooming house, and I believe that as the person who introduced this topic, it was probably my responsibility to kind of enlighten everyone as to the nitty-gritty of it. But I'm going to give Philippa a chance to answer this question about how do we define rooming houses, and in particular, what's the difference between a rooming house and say a group of students or seniors living as friends, like a roommate type situation. Could you clarify that?
Yes, and that's an important legal point. And in a number of other cities, in fact, it has led to legal proceedings. So I've experienced both when I was a student. I lived in a rooming house, and when I was living in the rooming house, I paid my rent directly to the owner of the rooming house. This was in Halifax. I went to Dalhousie. But when I left there, I went to a situation in which there were 5 of us sharing the top half of a house. I somehow managed to wind up as treasurer. I gathered all the rent, and that went collectively to the rooming house owner, or the house owner. It was not a rooming house. So the main legal difference is either each individual person who rents a room has an individual legal relationship with the landlord or owner operated, as opposed to a group of people coming together. They may be friends already, or they may just come together for the purpose of sharing space when they're students, and they collectively relate to the owner operator. And there have been actual cases where in cities in Waterloo and in Oshawa, where the question has arisen, is this a rooming house or not, according to the rules? And it's usually come down to the tenants saying, no, actually, we're a group of people renting this house as a group of people, even though there might be changes in the group from time to time. So that's one of the crucial differences.
Got it. So if you just have a lease with your fellow roommates with the landlord, then you're a single household renting, say, a 2 or 3 bedroom, whereas a rooming house, it's a self-enclosed unit, but then it shares a kitchen or a
yes, and the owner operator gets to choose who lives there. So when you have a group of friends, they generally determine who gets to live there, who gets to join the group. Otherwise, it's the owner operator who decides who he or she will rent to.
So it looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience. But I don't want to put you out on a limb here, Philippa, but I'd be interested to know if you have any examples of how other cities have maybe had a better regulatory framework for protecting this endangered source of housing.
Yes, well, I did a study looking at other cities, and it's quite interesting. I mean, the regulations, I mean, they can regulate anything they like. So in Barrie, for example, the regulations, there's a regulation about whether or not there are internal locks in the rooming houses, whether the people who have the rooms can lock their rooms from other people. In Oshawa, they have one about backyard fences. The whole backyard has to be fenced. All kinds of different things. You can put anything you like in those regulations if you can get it passed. There are problems where there is a definition of a rooming house in the zoning bylaw, a different definition in the licensing bylaw. So lots of opportunities for confusion and slippage. But in terms of who is doing a good job, I think the city of Ottawa is doing a reasonable job, or at least the last time I looked at them, it was. And it's been a couple of years since I did that study, looking at different jurisdictions across Canada. And they have a team, and the city works sort of takes a team approach whereby they get different departments, fire and public health and building inspections and so forth, to work together to resolve problems and keep rooming houses operating. I see Joy is going to talk a little bit more about that, so I won't go too far there, but yes, there's the licensing and zoning can add all kinds of additional restrictions if they like, about what does and does not constitute a rooming house. But the team approach to enforcement certainly seems to be one of the more successful approaches.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to hear more about how other cities are better dealing with this over the course of the event. We've got a few other questions here, but I think we're going to move on to our next presenters, and then we're going to have until 8 o'clock at night, if you stick with us, to answer them and to kind of talk a bit more. So I just want to thank Philippa a lot for sharing your knowledge and for focusing on this important subject in a way that, in kind of a level of detail that has really helped people stay up to date on it. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
So our next speaker is Joy Connolly, and Joy is an affordable housing consultant and advocate, and her interest in rooming houses actually began over 40 years ago when she lived for her first 4 years in Toronto in a rooming house downtown. And I'll just say that Joy has been an earnest and powerful advocate for the rights of rooming house tenants, and has been central to bringing attention to the injustices faced by this community for many years. And Joy actually runs a blog called Opening the Window, which is full of great analysis of housing policy in Toronto, and I wanted to pitch that because it's been a real a great source for me as I try to understand municipal housing politics. So Opening the Window. But Joy, please take it away.
Well, Jeremy, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the plug. And I want to give a plug. Philippa, your comments were so helpful. I was taking notes like crazy. If there are people on this call who have not read Philippa's work on the histories of rooming houses in Toronto and some of the comparative work that she's done, read them. They're so informative and also just so interesting. You just can't believe it. So I really want to commend them to you. They really had a big impact on me. So I was very glad to be invited to this presentation and this discussion because, as Jeremy mentioned, I used to live in a rooming house. When I first came to Toronto as a student, I lived in campus co-op. I shared a house with 13 other people. And then, like Philippa, we must be like twins. I also moved to a house with 3 other people. There were 4 of us in the house. And for me, it was important because I knew no one else in Toronto. And so I made lifelong friends in those houses. But also, it allowed me to live on the cheap, cheaper than student residences, an apartment, or a flat. So in Toronto today, there are thousands of single people, young and old, who, like me, are either new to the city or don't have much money and just need a room to live in. And for most, it's a simple matter of economics. Okay, so it's simple economics. The average room in Toronto rents for somewhere between $400 and $750 per month. The average rent for a vacant bachelor apartment is more than double that. So it's no wonder that people are doubling up, even in bachelor or 1-bedroom apartments, and certainly in rooming houses. We don't know how many people live in rooming houses in Toronto. In 2014, Lisa Freeman, who some of you might know, estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals. It's probably more now. What we do know, as Philippa has pointed out, that the distribution of rooming houses has changed as the downtown is gentrified and more low-income people move to the inner suburbs. So it was high time, as Philippa has pointed out, that the city step up and once again attempted to create a coherent and unified approach to zoning and regulating rooming houses in Toronto. Next slide. So I want to speak to the elements of the framework that City Council's Planning and Housing Committee approved last June, and that is coming before City Council for the second time. It was deferred from City Council's July meeting when they saw that they didn't have a majority vote. And it's now coming forward either this Friday or next Monday at the City Council meeting. And I'm going to look at these elements one by one. Next slide. So people were asking about a definition of multi-tenant house. And they're using the language multi-tenant house rather than rooming house. And it's basically the same as the definition that's been used in the City of Toronto for many years. 4 or more rooms for rent with shared kitchen, shared bathroom, or both. Note there are some exclusions to this, and note the exclusion of student residences or student co-ops, but fraternities and sororities are included. And at the July council meeting, they requested more discussion on how the rules would apply to them. Next slide. Next, a citywide zoning framework. This is the big breakthrough in the form of an amendment to the zoning bylaw. It's the best part of the entire city staff proposal and the foundation for everything that comes after. At last, maybe we will see rooming houses permitted in all residential zones in the Toronto. The issue of parking requirements, often a big issue, but in fact are pretty lenient. There are no parking requirements at all for houses with 6 rooms in areas well served by transit, such as the former city of Toronto and some major streets in the inner suburbs. And only 2 parking spots for similarly sized houses in other neighborhoods. Many houses in the inner suburbs already have 2 parking spaces, often a garage and a driveway. So for many houses, this will not be an additional requirement. It just reflects the status quo. However, there is a poison pill, and that is a room cap with a limit of 6 rooms in most residential areas. And I'm going to pick up that issue later on in the presentation. Next slide. There are new licensing requirements. I'm not going to go through these one by one. Personally, I didn't have any concerns about the list. They're all things that any good landlord could do. My bigger question was really about the process of obtaining a license. In the past, it's been slow, lots of hoops, uncoordinated, and what I'm hoping for is that the focus will be on facilitating the creation of affordable rooms, not obstructing them. But again, there is a poison pill. It's the compliance with the Ontario Building Code. Someone asked a question about that, and I'll come back to that later in the presentation too. Next slide. There are also new requirements for personal care homes. This isn't a topic I know much about. I do know that this is a sector where the exploitation of the most vulnerable people in Toronto. The requirements to me seem reasonable and necessary, but I would defer to those who know more than I do about this topic. And then next, the topic that really is of the most interest to the inner suburban councillors is the compliance and enforcement program. It's an interdivisional approach. That's good news. Although I actually wonder why Shelter Support and Housing Division is not on the list, since they are the division with the biggest stake in both the adequate supply of affordable rooms. That's how people move out of shelters. And they're the ones that pick up the pieces if a tenant is displaced from a rooming house and ends up in the shelter system. There's also a focus on education and outreach for both tenants and landlords. That's a good thing. The staff report envisions annual inspections, biannual for owner-occupied houses. Resourcing is the key issue here raised by councillors, and Philippa, you alluded to this. Municipal Licensing and Standards Division currently has 6 inspectors dedicated to rooming houses. The current staff recommendation is for it to be 28 inspectors. And Fire Services is planning to hire 16 new inspectors just for rooming houses. There are also some big penalties that are being proposed: tickets to landlords for less serious offenses, increased fines of up to $100,000 and more, or $10,000 per day for continuing offenses. The city can conduct remedial action. Landlord doesn't do something they're supposed to do, charge the cost back to operators, with a multi-tenant house licensing tribunal to hear appeals. So my take on all of this, next slide. I've mentioned a number of strengths of the staff's proposal. I just wanted to highlight 3 more. Next slide. First, an anchor of Toronto's 10-year housing plan is that housing is a right. But to the best of my knowledge, this is the first major housing initiative actually rooted in this work. As Philippa has mentioned, the city report cites both the Ontario Human Rights Commission's own statements that Toronto's zoning bylaw falls short of the Ontario Human Rights Code, and that the restrictions have an ongoing, quote, real and significant negative impact on groups protected by the Human Rights Code. The city, next slide, also took it one step further in contracting with Maitrey, a foundation, to undertake a human rights review of the city's draft policy. This analysis, led by the wonderful Emily Paradis, whom I think many of you know, looked not just at the blatant acts of discrimination, but also the positive elements of a human rights approach. And the hope is that this type of analysis becomes the norm whenever the city considers housing policy. Next slide. The second big thing, I think, is the consciousness of the relationship between the availability of affordable rooms and the impact on homelessness, both for the individual tenant and on the city. It may seem obvious, but incredibly, until this round of consultations, that equation that we need affordable rooms and we can't afford displacements was rarely part of the rooming house discourse. And then finally, next slide, the city staff proposes a multi-year phase-in. The first year is to set the foundation, the second year to focus on existing rooming houses and houses with a history of complaints, and the third year to begin reaching out to new operators. I'll tell you, if they managed to do all this in 3 years, it would be amazing. But note the emphasis, if you're looking at the slide, on mitigating tenant displacement. The city staff is right to be nervous. Next slide. They're nervous because of the 2 poison pills I mentioned. A maximum of 6 rooms in most zones, regardless of the size of the house. And then also that, and there is some opportunity in zones where apartments or commercial residential permitted for them to be more rooms. But here's the problem. So next slide. So this is an example of a nonprofit multi-tenant house. It is a gorgeous house. It's inside and out, funded by the city as alternative housing for people who've been homeless or at risk of homelessness. If the city enforces the room cap as written, Toronto would lose 47 rooms in this house alone. It's around the size of a typical modular housing development for a similar population. Like SNAP, you could undo the work of a whole project of modular housing that's under development. We'd be losing rooms faster than we can create them. Now, honestly, I don't think there's any way in the world that the city is going to shut down this house. Nonprofit housing providers have been very clear that Toronto could lose hundreds of nonprofit rooms. Over 1/3 of supportive and alternative housing in Toronto is in the form of rooms, and the city would be nuts to not grant an exception to these houses. Next slide. But I'm more concerned about privately owned houses like this one. So it's a bungalow. There are lots just like it, with a high and dry basement, 4 bedrooms, kitchen and bathroom on the ground floor, and the same in the basement. On the face of it, a house like this would lose 2 rooms to meet the room cap of 6 rooms. But is that the direction the landlord will take? Next slide. Here are the actual costs of operating this house, including mortgage payments, taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance. The landlord charges $500 a month for tenants on the ground floor, $437 a month for tenants in the basement, and he makes a modest $723 a month, or $8,600 per year. That profit pays for his own time, since he doesn't hire staff and does a lot of the upkeep and maintenance himself. So what happens if he reduces the room count to 6? Say 3 bedrooms on the ground floor, 3 in the basement. He no longer breaks even. So he can raise the rents, be about $150, $160 per month per tenant that was left. Definitely a possibility given how low his rents are in comparison to the rest of the market. Or he may turn the basement into a 2-bedroom apartment, or he may start to question the amount of work that needs to go into maintaining the property versus the money he could get by selling, and decide to pack it in. Either way, there is a risk to tenants of increased rents or displacement. Next slide. Entering into the landlord's calculation may be the cost of bringing his house to code, and particularly the cost of meeting the fire safety requirements under the Ontario Building Code. So this is a topic that perplexed me when I first started to think about rooming houses. So I lived in this 4-bedroom house 40 years ago. It was a lovely house, you never call it a fire trap. But the landlord said to us when we moved in, if an inspector shows up at the door, do not let him in. And now I know why. The challenge presented by the Ontario Building Code is that it conceives of rooming houses in the same way as it does apartment buildings. So if you picture a typical apartment building, every suite is separated from every other. Every suite opens onto a fire-separated corridor, which feeds directly to fire-separated stairwells to 2 exits. The problem, of course, is that most rooming houses are converted from family-style houses. So you have front doors that open directly onto stairs or onto the living room, but you can't have a sofa in a corridor. You have lots of houses, my house is like this, they have a back door off the kitchen, but you can't have a stove in a corridor. You have to create separated corridors that can take residents from their bedrooms to the exits. Next slide. So a while back, I took a look. I think I am in the wrong, it should be a table that's on the slide. There we go. Oh, you had it with the table. That's it. Thank you. A while back, I took a look at the costs of rooming houses, just 5, a sample of 5, but just to get a feel for the issue. So you'll see our bungalow. It's has the lowest cost per tenant. It's the second item on that line. There's also a Scarborough 2-story plus basement. It's typical of houses near U of T Scarborough. And then there are costs associated with 3 downtown not-profit houses. These renovations happened a while ago, so likely costs have escalated since then. But I want to make 2 points. The first is that there are steep costs for any landlord. There are also costs that will actually reduce their property values. The vast majority of purchases are families. They're not other rooming house operators. They don't want dark corridors. They don't want hard separations between rooms, between the dining room and the kitchen, between the front door and the living room. They don't want ugly sprinkler systems. So my guess is that most owners confronted with costs like these will just sell. And we could see a massive displacement of tenants. And where on earth would they go at rents that they could afford? But I also note that the average of cost of bringing, well, these 5 houses, who knows if they're typical or not, to code is just under $17,000 per house. For a landlord, that's a lot. For the city, it's peanuts. These houses are providing affordable rents with no government subsidies. Think of what it costs to build a new unit. $250,000, $300,000, I'm not sure. A typical housing allowance is $500 a month and up. That equals $6,000 per year, and your costs are only going to go up every year, and you're committed to that for the long term. So subsidizing these one-time costs, perhaps a low or no interest loan, time to maintaining affordability, would be the bargain of the century. And this is something, to give them credit, that city staff are exploring. Next slide. So I know Regini is going to talk about advocacy, but I just want to make one statement about advocacy myself, and it's about keeping the pressure on. This week now, the drive is to legalize rooming houses across the city. It's the foundation for everything else. But after the vote, if we're successful in that, we need to keep the pressure on. We need to support city staff's recommendation to reduce the costs of code requirements. So they're thinking of hiring a consultant to find, are there cheaper ways to meet the code? That's good news. And also they're thinking about providing grants and loans to offset renovation expenses. And in the long term, we need to address room caps. Of course, exempting nonprofit properties, also grandfathering existing private sector houses, and also pressing for an approach based on existing property standards, not on an arbitrary cap. So that's my spiel, and I'm looking forward to Regini carrying on to talk about the fight ahead.
Joy, thank you so much for that presentation, and you're really opening us up to have a powerful discussion about what it's going to take to get, you know, from this gateway of legalizing rooming houses, if we do in fact win that vote on Friday, but to a whole series of questions around what it's going to take to actually fund the rehabilitation of some of these units that have been left in this black market, and whether, you know, there'll be strong affordability requirements tied to those to ensure that you know, these tenants are actually protected in the process. But I'm going to hold off on getting into that because I want to introduce Regini David, who is a paralegal, outreach and law reform coordinator for the West Scarborough Community Legal Services. So Regini is also part of many different housing groups and networks across the city, such as the Right to Housing Toronto, Power and Community, Fighting for Affordable Homes, and the City Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, and Voices of Scarborough to address the current housing crisis. So if you thought your email was full, I'm sure Regini is part of some very important conversations. Yeah, so she has been advocating for the legalization of the rooming houses for over 10 years, and we're delighted to hear to learn from her tonight. Take it away, Regina.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Philippa and Joe, for the excellent presentation. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel to talk about the important issue that's affecting many vulnerable tenants. The Scarborough Community Legal Services, we provide legal advice, legal representation on law relating to poverty for low-income individuals in Scarborough for over 33 years. One of the major area of our work is assisting low-income tenants. Multi-tenant homes, you know, provide affordable homes to so many low-income groups that we work with. For example, Ontario work and ODSP recipients, students, seniors, people with disability, and new immigrants. Even when I came to Canada as a refugee, I lived in a rooming house too. And I know how important those homes are because from my personal experience, otherwise I will not able to pay for, you know, the market rent. I would like to see how many of you have lived in the rooming houses or living in the rooming houses. You could raise your hand or just put it in the chat box. Well, I'm pretty sure that many, you know, students and even like people that we know live in these homes. But however, the current bylaw is discriminating the marginalized people. And as rooming houses are not allowed in Scarborough and many other parts of the city where most immigrants, working poor and racialized and low income people live. And I have around 7 minutes video that will give you some background about the research from Lisa Freeman and the work that tenants have been doing to legalize rooming house on the grassroots level. Maybe Jeremy, you could play the video.
Rooming houses provide much needed affordable housing throughout the Greater Toronto Area. They were once thought to be a downtown phenomena, but are becoming more and more visible throughout the inner suburbs.
Scarborough has diverse community, and it is one of the top immigrant recipient place in this country, and there are a lot of rooming houses, and people, some of them, even landlords or people living in rooming houses, don't know that these are, defined as rooming houses.
Really what a rooming house is a building where people don't have self-contained apartments, where they may have a kitchen in their unit, they may have a bathroom in their unit, or they may have neither and share those facilities with other people.
Rooming houses are very important, and it's provide affordable homes for many low-income tenants, especially for many new immigrants and students and people with disability. People are forced to live with cockroaches, mouse, mold, and in an overcrowding situation. We see, the houses are designed for 4, but 8 or 10 people living in the house or basement apartments. And we also see that there is a lot of harassment and human rights issue that tenants are facing. For example, tenants are asked not to cook their ethnic food. Landlord making comments about their ethnic background, and landlord comes to their rooms without any notice.
They were living like 3-4 students or 3-4 people in one room. But when I compare myself with those guys, so I was shocked, like things are really worse for those guys. And they were saying hygienically, those buildings, those rooms were not good. They had like no repairs, like things were broken in that rooms and apartments.
Old City of Toronto, which is kind of the more downtown part of the city, set up a licensing system to try to improve the quality of housing in rooming houses. So landlords are required to get a license to operate a rooming house, and prior to getting that license, there are inspections to ensure that the housing is suitable for people to live in.
This licensing bylaw, however, does not exist in Toronto's inner suburbs. Scarborough and North York do not have any rooming house licensing bylaws. Etobicoke, on the other hand, only has a limited bylaw that licenses approximately 7 houses. Rooming houses are not welcomed in the majority of the inner suburbs and are prohibited altogether through exclusionary zoning bylaws.
It's a very discriminatory bylaw since it's legal in some parts of Toronto, not in the suburbs, and research shows that racialized population has moved to the inner suburbs.
Rooming houses are not just located in one ward or neighborhood, they are present throughout the inner suburbs. I interviewed 75 rooming house tenants for my doctoral research at the University of Toronto. Many tenants in Scarborough live in rooming houses to be close to people in their community. I interviewed newcomers to Canada, migrant and temporary workers, international students, and long-term residents of Scarborough. My research findings indicate that suburban rooming houses do indeed provide safe and clean living conditions for low-income tenants. Not all of them are in poor condition, but all of them are illegal under municipal zoning bylaws.
The city should block our basic need, basic rights to live in our neighborhoods where we have our friends, families, doctors and others.
நாங்கள் என்ன நிலையில் இருக்கிறோம், அதுக்கு ஏற்ற நிவர்த்தியை செய்து கொடுப்போம் என்று அரசாங்கம் நினைக்காது. நாங்கள் போராடினால்தான் கிடைக்கும். நாங்கள் என்ன போல ஆட்கள் பல பேர் போராடினால்தான் இப்படியான ஆட்கள் வரவழைச்சு, இப்படி மீடியாக்கள் வரவழைச்சு இந்த மக்கள்கிட்ட என்ன பிரச்சனை இருக்குது, இதை அரசாங்கத்துக்கு சொல்ல யார் முன்வாரா, அப்படியான ஆட்கள் முன் வந்தால் தான் உண்மைகள் அரசாங்கத்துக்கு தெரியும். அப்போ நாங்கள் எங்களை போல ஆட்கள் போராடித்தான் பல விஷயத்தை செய்ய வேண்டிய வாழ்க்கை முறையில் நாங்கள் இருக்கிறோம்.
I'm shocked and I do not understand why I have been treated differently than other tenants who have more money and better health.
So I add my voice to theirs, and it's a scream for justice for all of those underhoused, all of those homeless, all of those on the waiting list, all of those who need what is their human right, a home.
Making the rooming houses in Scarborough illegal, they are taking away our basic rights. I am very disappointed at city councillors for not allowing legal affordable housing for us. I am speaking out because I know how necessary rooming houses are to me and many others in Scarborough in many cities.
We strongly believe that rooming houses should be legally allowed and monitored in our neighborhood and across the city in order to address the reality of the rooming houses and including fair treatment for disadvantaged group. Excluding rooming houses from residential neighborhoods violate the Ontario Human Rights Code. The Toronto Community Charter says all tenants should be able to live in their neighborhood of choice without discrimination. We want our rights not only in paper, we want them in reality. We want our landlord to respect our rights. We want our politicians to respect our basic rights by including them in our city bylaws and policies.
Thank you for playing that video. So you could see that tenants and advocates were, fighting for this issue for over a decade. And as Philippa said, this is not, even 10 years. It's a 20 years fight. And then many of the housing rooming house tenants and housing advocates educating the city staff and councillors and mayors on an ongoing basis through meetings, discussion, deputation, submission, petition, and media articles. And after years of fight, and as Joy mentioned, the city has recognized that these rooming houses provide affordable homes. And now the city staff have suggested to be legalized. But councillor had discussed this so many times, but still are split on this issue. As Joy said, this issue will be going for vote on October 1st or October 4th. So we need your support to continue to tell our mayor to support this legalization and why this issue cannot be ignored and delayed anymore. Because, so long tenants are fighting and advocates are working on this. This is a great opportunity for us to tell, and there's a chance for to win this fight by putting pressure to the mayor, because as you said, there are so many councillors, especially Scarborough councillors, are so much against the idea of legalization. So I think we have a small window of time to really put pressure. Already so many universities, even University of Toronto, all universities and York University and student unions have sent the letter, and also many organizations are continually sending letter to mayor. And I would actually request that you also tell him that these illegal housing provide affordable homes to thousands of people. Simply shutting these homes down would create a massive homeless crisis. Tenants who are living in these illegal multi-tenant homes are afraid to complain or take legal action about unsafe or unfair condition because of fear and being shut down and left homeless. And as a result, tenants in these homes in some neighborhoods lack key rights and protection. By regulating, neighbors' concerns about these homes can be also addressed effectively the way the city have been addressing them in the neighborhood where they are legal and regulated. Applying the same rule across the city makes sense and has been recommended by repeated studies and reviews. Tell the mayor tenants should be free to choose to live near their community, temples, churches, mosques without any barriers. The city should look at this issue through human rights lens as promised. The city bylaw should respect the human rights and Toronto Housing Charter. Toronto rooming houses is not only provide affordable homes to tenants, it also helping many middle-income landlords, especially racialized families, to be able to pay their mortgage by renting the portion of their home. Currently, many rooming house rental income are not reported. Many rooming house tenants are not reflected in the Census Canada as they are illegal and operating underground. This has also led to less funding for hospital and services in certain neighborhoods like Scarborough, which further affects disadvantaged people. For example, Scarborough has 70% of our populations are racialized and underserved. Therefore, the city has to really consider this issue and also has to, city has been holding so many consultation, discussion, and tackling this issue for almost 2 decades, as Philippa said. We need to conclude and address the inequality and reality of our community needs and create a city bylaw that is more inclusive. And I will encourage you to contact Mayor and ask him to support, because we need all kind of a pressure and support to get through this fight that we have been working on for years. And also this is affect all of, even our community, students and people that we work with. Thank you.
Thank you, Regini, and thank you so much for sharing that video. I just makes me miss the days that we could be, even if it looked very cold, we could be standing with our friends in Parkdale and a really diverse crew and just, taking part in an event like that. So hopefully sooner than later, and for that matter, hopefully we'll be able to do an event like this in person together sooner than later. Something that I really miss personally. But I wanted to. So I want to invite again everyone to put some questions in the chat if you have them, or raise your hand if you'd like to share your thoughts over the microphone. I do have a few questions of my own, and one in particular is moving into this vote in the next few days. You've mentioned that it's really important to let the mayor know that we're strongly in support of this policy, and I'm wondering for those who would say, well, the mayor is in fact kind of demonstrating support for this, has shown support. Is it a question of whether the mayor is actually behind the scenes, really kind of like trying to whip the vote, trying to say, for those who have kind of voted with me on different things in suburban ridings that are councillors that are holding out, what could the mayor be doing to really flip a few of those votes? Is there something that we should be stressing right now to get that vote won?
One of the thing is, from the last time when the issue came and there wasn't enough vote, the mayor have differed. and now and I think is, Joy can talk from her experience. It's very close, and we need to really get councillors on board. And not only the mayor has power also to look at these issues and talk to council, because this is not only really an issue, it's also a human rights issue, and as a councillor, as a mayor, he has an obligation to address this, and also city has committed to look at look this issue through human rights lens, and they need to address this. And also we have tried, I know that not only us, there's so many other housing advocates across the city have tried and talked to the councillors. Even in Scarborough, almost every councillors for last 10 years, we were advocating. In the beginning, they didn't even understand the issue. At least now they understand that it's an affordable home, but still, as Joy mentioned, they're still worried about, the whole, how is other owners will be taken this support. But I think there is a chance of mayor also working with the councillors. Therefore, it's an important that we talk to him. And Joe, I don't know if you want to add anything to it.
Yes, Regina, just to affirm what you said, the rumor has it, and rumor from various sources, is that council it's an absolute tie, and they are deadlocked on that tie. In other words, not only is there equal number of votes on either side, but they are firm votes. So what to do? And it seems like the most effective thing at this moment is to put pressure on the mayor's office. The mayor is supportive of the staff report and going forward with legalization across the city, and that is his true belief. But he is not with the vote in the same way as he has on occasion for other votes. And I'm sure he's talked to every single councillor and tried to be persuasive, but there's persuasion and persuasion. So that seems to be the strategy that a number of groups are saying in these last moments, having talked to everyone, having gone to all the consultations, having written letters to your councillor and had meetings with councillors in these last days. It seems that will be the most effective in bringing this to fruition. If only if it means, frankly, we're down to the stage of, wouldn't it be helpful if one of the people who are the no votes, who simply, they don't feel strongly about rooming houses, they just are afraid of not being reelected. Wouldn't it be helpful if they just went to the bathroom at the same time that the vote was held? We may be down to something as simple as that.
Yeah, so really comes down to, God, with such a tight vote, is the mayor really earnestly using his bully pulpit, his platform right now to push that, and we will see in the coming days. We have a question from Kristen. If you understand correctly, councillors are afraid to not get re-elected if they vote in favor of this. What are the main reasons the general public wouldn't want rooming houses in their neighborhood and vote to not re-elect if they did pass the bylaw? Certainly a really important question.
I think it's definitely the voting is one of the concern, because some owners are really fighting against legalization. Even some of the consultation city held, some of the owners, especially from Scarborough, openly sort of saying, not in our backyard, our property price will go down. And if it is, if this is an issue affecting most vulnerable and racialized, go back where you come from, openly, discriminating, those kind of a discussion. And then for councillors, hearing that some house owners are really against it, they are worried about the voting. And also many tenants are also, they're speaking up, but not in the large way that they could, because one of the reason also they're afraid that the city could find out where they are living, their homes can be shut down. And many of these consultation, tenants don't participate, and we had to find different ways to include them, and we have been doing that. So definitely the voting is one of the concern of councillors, and also hearing what other owners are saying. And they're very active. In Scarborough, for example, we have a senior group, house owners, and they put quite a lot of time to fight back.
I'm interested in others who have views on this. I'm sort of a downtowner, and I think for many downtowners, there's something about that people, particularly in Scarborough, but in other areas as well, it's a visceral feeling. It's not about a particular rooming house or rooming houses on their street or whatever. It could be that, but it's also a deep feeling about what the suburbs are, you know, what their neighborhood is. And it's a community of homeowners. And it's a deep feeling that, and it feels that the rooming houses are somehow a violation of that ideal. I don't know, Regini, if you have experienced that.
Yeah, I think it's not only rooming houses, even any housing initiative that's, you know, city is proposing, and I'm seeing Housing Now project, same concern. It's not in our backyard, not close to my home. My, you know, home price is going to go down. We don't want low-income people near our neighborhood. So that sort of, you know, feedback I hear a lot from house owners.
Great. Well, we're getting a lot of good questions in here, and I wanted to try to tie a few of them together, and you know, bring us back to a really important point that I think Joy's presentation finished on, which is, again, you know, the legalizing of this of these units and of getting a, you know, a regulatory framework citywide. You know, this is the gateway to getting these units rehabilitated to be, you know, adequate for tenants. And of course, some of them are, but many of them are, you know, have long-standing issues, and what comes with that is a great risk that if one is required to kind of bring their unit, these rooming houses up to code, you know, it could cost, you know, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 per room, and as Joy was stressing, you know, these new costs could end up being passed on to tenants through, you know, multiple above guideline increases. You know, or you know, they could to incentivize the owner to sell this off to to gentrifiers or to developers trying to get a land assembly. I can say that I see on real estate Twitter, you know, developers actively kind of talking to each other about how, oh, there's a rooming house here. We could assemble, you know, building services, because these, you know, rooming houses don't have as many protections, so they're easier to kind of get tenants out of there and build up. So it's a really pressing concern. And what I'm wondering is, you know, what precedents are there for governments to provide that kind of rehabilitation funding, which would be necessary to bring these units up to code? And you know, could such programs come with, you know, long-term affordability requirements to kind of keep these tenants safe?
So there's a fairly recent example. In 2015, the City of Toronto administered a program with senior government funding, and it was a renovation program. It was directed towards rooming house operators, and the concept was low interest loans, and the loans would be forgivable loans, with a proviso if they kept rents affordable in the units over a period of X number of years. I've forgotten how many years it was. So there is that kind of experience. There was a question about federal government funding. There is, from time to time, there are funds available for renovations and certainly new construction administered by the city. And so there is some potential there. I would say that in general, the federal government has not been strong on preserving existing rental housing. Most of the focus is around expanding, like increasing the supply of new affordable housing, but the potential does exist.
I think with an important caveat that TCHC did just receive over $1 billion to rehabilitate, for much needed repairs. But in terms of the private rental stock,
That's right, the private
yeah,
rental stock. Yeah.
in terms of the private rental stock, I want to ask you then, for those federal, and perhaps provincial funds that do exist, could the city, target some of those to support, a program like this? Is that something that we could be advocating for counselors to step up and say, hey, we need these programs to allow us to use this for those purposes? Or do we just need a new funding program?
That 2015 program that I mentioned, that's exactly what they did.
Good. Okay. So there's another, I think, really important question, which Seema has reminded us of, which is, both of you have expressed a concern that for the majority of the areas in which rooming houses could be legalized under the city's proposal, there is a cap of 6 rooms. And Joy, you've called this a poison pill. Why would the city put that in place? And what proportion of just as a guesstimate, what proportion of rooming houses do you think are over that amount within those areas?
Yes, I feel like, I wish I'd read more carefully the staff report right before this meeting, because I'm not clear on the rationale for 6 bedrooms specifically. I know that they want to put a limit because, again, they're concerned about neighbors thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to be completely swamped by tenants, everywhere. This used to be an owner-occupied, neighborhood, and now it's going to turn into this. And the other rationale we're concerned about is overcrowding, which is a legitimate concern in rooming houses. My view is that room caps are not the way to do that. We have property standards in the city already that give, if you have a bedroom, it needs to be X, number of square feet. You can use that to regulate how many bedrooms can fit in a particular house. So I don't think we need it for overcrowding purposes. And I think the number 6 was kind of an arbitrary number. That's my sense. It kind of felt right. How many people would affect? It would affect pretty much everyone in the inner suburbs. So the zones where it's this maximum of 6 is in are the zones for residential detached, residential semi-detached, and townhouses. And that's mostly what you have in the suburbs.
But do you expect that there's a significant amount of currently illegal rooming houses operating in those areas that have more than 6, and therefore will remain in the black market?
The norm.
Yes. Even you could see from the video, and I was with Lisa, went around the city. We interviewed tenants in York, Toronto, Scarborough, Etobicoke. Most of those homes had 8 rooms or even 10. Like some of the houses around York University, they are huge. It's almost like mansion homes, well maintained, and had around 10, 11 tenants, and many of them got shut down too because of the whole zoning requirement too. And same thing I see in Scarborough. Most of the bungalow homes made into rooming houses, and as Joey described, basement mostly 4-bedroom, and then up on the top floor another 4-bedroom, and at least many times we see that 8 to 10 in big homes.
Yeah. So like the village at York University, if that 6-bedroom cap was applied, there would not be a single rooming house left in the entire district, unless I've got the zoning wrong. I think the zoning there is would be for 6 rooms, I think. And that's true near U of T Scarborough campus as well. Those are often 2-story houses plus full basement. They have lots of rooms.
Well, that's truly sobering. So lots of work to be done, and I wonder if we're going to see, I guess it's so close to the wire that it's unlikely that there'll be further amendments put forward to this by progressive councillors who want to kind of fix that lacuna. But clearly, even if this passes, many rooming houses will remain in the black market. I want to actually move on to a question for Regini. You've written that Toronto's kind of patchy approach to regulating rooming houses has pushed many into a black market in which, I quote, "the very illegality makes them almost irresistible to exploitative landlords as they gain control over tenants, don't incur expenses, and earn high profits under the table." So I wonder if you can talk in more detail about some of these landlords, exploitative practices. And I wanted to kind of chime in that we got a comment from Chi Yi saying that in Chinatown that she knows of several, or they know of several rooming house landlords who limit the time people can use the stove, for example. And the worst one limited to 10 minutes per person per day. So talk about controlling, tenants' lives and how this regulatory framework could kind of hopefully put a stop to that.
Some of the thing is what I have seen, because from clinic, we also get calls from rooming house tenants too. And landlord illegally increasing their rent without following the rent increase guideline. And even sometime, just I had a client who have actually got increased every 3 months because now, the price has gone up. This is just lately. And then it's also the repair issue is the main concern we hear from tenants too, or not having enough heat. And the repair issue. When they complain, landlord, they don't take any action, but tenants can call the city and complain, and then they will actually come, and normally even it's faster than complaining to Residential Tenancy Act and taking the whole process, calling 311 and complaining to the city. But however, there are tenants who call the city of Toronto, and then when the city came, found out that there's no zoning, their homes were shut down. So the fear of, even though they know that's not right, there's repair issue, there is, unfair rent increase, even some of the landlords sometimes enter without notice. That's another common thing we hear. And also we, you may have seen, there was some article from, students from University of Toronto, without any notice, they've been evicted, and those are the common issues. And then tenants, even though they know their rights, and they're still afraid of taking any legal action.
So I think that brings up an important question, which Emily Power, one of my colleagues on the Affordable Housing Challenge Project, has brought up, which are for tenants who are put under these at times like humiliating levels of control over their lives because they're not able to advocate for themselves for fear of losing their home. What are ways that they can organize and put direct pressure on landlords to improve their conditions? We've talked so much about kind of trying to put our energies into changing planning law around this, but can you provide some good examples of maybe some successful struggles that have kind of made real changes from the landlords?
Sure. One of the thing is, even though the rooming houses are not regulated by city level, but all the rooming houses are protected under Residency Tenancy Act, long as they don't share kitchen or bathroom with the landlord. And what we do is, when people call our clinics, many tenants don't want to take legal action, we negotiate with landlord. we also, the tenants, educate tenants about their rights more, and then they get involved. And that's why you see quite a lot of tenants also, getting involved. And I know that not only legal clinics, there are other nonprofit organizations. They do, negotiate with landlord to resolve issues without taking legal route, and that happens. And also I think is what is important is empowering tenant and to making sure that they know their rights, because we see that quite a lot of new immigrant with language barriers, people are in these home, and seniors are now, because the pension is not enough, and many of them are also the rooming house providing them also as an affordable home. So we try to also do public legal education about their basic rights, going to different community groups and going to their community and through social media and different languages and so on, to organize and empower people. And we also have tenants group where people come and talk to each other and support each other, and then work on this issue, advocating to make change. So when it's legal, hopefully, tenants will be able to openly speak out without fearing that their homes will be shut down.
I actually had a question for Regini. And Regini, have you had much success with rooming house tenants going straight to the landlord-tenant board with complaints? Because the landlord-tenant board does not have the power to shut them down. In a way, it seems like a safer path for them. What has been your experience?
I'm pretty sure I have my other colleagues who focus around the landlord, and there are cases that we have filed and we were able to resolve it. But many times rooming house tenants prefer just to resolve it by negotiating than taking legal action, knowing that, because they don't, even though the Residency Tenancy Act and the landlord and tenant board will not able to enforce the city bylaw, but that for tenants, it's even though you're explaining, and it's still hard, and the fear is still there.
Thank you.
So I want to move now to I think a potential solution for many tenants, which we haven't discussed today, which would come in the form of kind of a series of funds probably from the provincial or federal government to acquire rooming houses which are kind of at risk of, they're on the market and they're at risk of being sold to a company that's that's planning to gentrify them, or to even convert them into condos, which legislation has permitted, although this is a whole nother story. But Joy and I were, and I guess Regini too, were involved in many deputations for quite a few years to try to get the city to extend their rental replacement policy, which protects rental units with 6 or more, rental buildings with 6 or more units. It ensures that if those buildings are redeveloped, tenants within them will get to kind of have the right to return to their units at a more or less the same rent they were paying, and also provide kind of subsidies to ensure they're in the interim they're paying similar rents to what they were. And this policy, which has been in place for 15 years, hasn't been extended to tenants of rooming houses, which is just remarkable. And so, the city did, this is a great win, I think, for advocates. The city did extend that rental replacement policy from being about purpose-built rental from being about rental to being also about rooming house rental. Although, as Joy can tell you, it's caught up right now because it's been appealed by some of those exploitative landlords that Regini was talking about. But that's a big footnote to what I wanted to ask, which is, the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust has as a strategy right now where they're trying to get funds to actually go onto the market and purchase rooming houses that have been that are on the market and are at risk of being lost. And I'm wondering, is there was going to say the rapid housing initiative, which came with quite a few billions of dollars from the federal government, there was a huge push from advocates to say, this funding shouldn't just be for new rental. You should also be allowing municipalities to give it to nonprofits like the Parc de Land Trust, who are going to acquire these units. And you could actually save a lot of money doing that, because it might cost, say, $150,000 per room to buy up an existing rooming house, whereas building a new one could literally be double, sometimes triple that. I'm wondering, is there, do you think there's an appetite of the federal government to, take a lot of the funds they're giving now and also allow it to be used to buy existing units? And why aren't they? And, with such a clear, cost incentive for doing so, such a clear, like, bang for your buck?
There hasn't seemed to be much of an move on the federal government's point on their part, and beats me why, because I agree with you entirely.
Yeah, so perhaps that's that's another fight, and then the subject of another affordable housing challenge project seminar, because there has been a real concerted push, which I know again Joy has been part of, to get a fund from the federal government for nonprofits trying to acquire existing at-risk housing. As you say, it's baffling that this is not a part of the national housing strategy.
I'm just reading a statement from Chi Tam. CMHC just released for the first time a CLT and Land Assembly national demonstration. Not acquisition funds. Okay. There we go. Thank you.
Well, it'll be interesting to hear more about that. And if you have information, Chi, you're welcome to share it with us. But do we have any more questions? Or Joy, do you have more questions for Regini? Regini, do you have questions for Joy?
We talk all the time.
That's your chance to do it in front of 40 people. I think then we'll kind of wrap it up here. Thank you to everyone for. Okay, so Kristen's got a good question, which is how can we find out the outcome of this on Friday? I'm sure the Toronto Star will be reporting this. I'm sure that it will be reported by major news as to what action takes place. I believe the CBC also reported on when this was deferred by council. So Joy, did you have something to say?
Yeah, you can also follow along. So if you go to the City of Toronto's website, click on the menu for City Council, they have a fabulous system actually for showing you, you can follow when things have been approved, deferred, what the decisions that have been made. They keep that, in real time. They also video the council meetings, so you can actually sit in on the council meeting during the time that it's on. They also post it on YouTube afterwards, and you can follow what the discussion was afterwards as well. But the City of Toronto's website has a fabulous section on City Council and all council committees, actually, just a fund of information.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and thank you, Diane, for sharing that that link. So I'll wrap up now and say, thank you so much to our presenters for all your efforts to kind of raise awareness about this important issue. It's clearly slipped through the cracks for far too long, and you're helping keep decision makers' feet to the fire on this topic. And I want to also thank everyone for being here to take the time to become more familiar with this issue. Okay, well, Diane's going to put a new link. So I want to encourage everyone. One thing you can do right now is go to this link that the FMTA, which is the Metro Tenants Association. They have a campaign right now where you can put your name and your email and your postal code, and it will send a letter to your councillor and also to the mayor kind of requesting their, their ardent support on this issue. And I encourage all of you to fill that out. We'll be posting a recording of this event on YouTube. So for those of you who haven't, you can subscribe to the Affordable Housing Challenge Project's YouTube page, and that'll make you aware of new event recordings that we're posting, and also you can watch like past events that we've hosted over the past years. So hope everyone has a very pleasant evening, and I can't wait till we can do this in person again, and remind each other of how many passionate, creative people there are in Toronto who really want to fight for a fairer, more interesting city. So good night.